Right, so the other aspect of interpersonal meaning that we want to talk about today is modality. And modality is the construction of the speaker and writer's opinion, and it also includes a particular type of modality that's known as polarity. And polarity, as I told you in my previous lecture, is the cline between the two extreme poles of yes and no. Okay. So let's imagine the cline like this, and let's have some examples of polarity markers, which would all be modal adjuncts. Okay, let's be even more precise than this. Modality is a resource for interpersonal deixis. What is interpersonal deixis? Deixis, as you know, is pointing at something, and in this case we're pointing at the relations between the people involved, and this is a key fundamental property in order to activate the speech functions that we talked about in my previous lectures. How does this happen? Well, this happens as we saw with mood, it happens with tense, it happens with polarity, which is a particular type of modality. Okay, and here you have a description of each of these. Alright, so as I told you, polarity and modality are two sides of the same coin. So if you read this quotation from the third edition of Introduction to Functional Grammar, you'll see this explained very clearly. So you might want to describe polarity as a choice between the two extremes of yes and no. And you know, the modality system, what it does is to construe, as we told, opinion, assessment, and therefore also the region of uncertainty that lies between yes and no. Okay, so within modality, we should draw two main distinctions, that between what we know, so epistemic knowledge, and what we must, what we have to do, obligation. So what's known as deontic modality. These are two words that come from Greek. The first one, episteme, means knowledge, and the second one, deon, means obligation. Okay, these are two, epistemic and deontic, general terms that you will find across a variety of disciplines, so including linguistics, but also in philosophy, in traditional grammar, Greek literature, of course. But if we want a term that's more specific to functional grammar, we will use modalization for epistemic meaning. That's for how much you know, for your degree of certainty, and modulation for obligation and inclination. So covering, generally covering the area that would be labeled in traditional terms as deontic. Okay, so within modalization, therefore, there are two main parts: probability and usuality. So when we want to talk about modalization, we want to quote these kinds of markers, be them verbs, that's finite modal operators, or modal adjuncts. Okay, that's adverbial expressions that have a modal sense. Of course, we can have both of them together, like it can't possibly be true. Yeah, that's can't and possibly. Both of those are modal, and both of them are modalization. And also multi-words expressions that talk about probability and usuality, those are also modal. Okay, talking about modulation. Modulation, as I told you before, is about obligation and inclination. So these would be its typical markers. Okay. And at this point, I'd like us to focus a little bit more about the types of lexicogrammatical devices that instantiate modality. Okay, so the modal operators are what traditional grammar would call auxiliary, so they are finite by definition. And you know, they don't want us to add an S in the third person. They don't want us to mark them for past or anything apart from dead, okay, but that's not modal, that's a finite, that's for tense, so it's a different thing. Must, you would never say musted, please don't say that ever. Okay, so they behave basically like auxiliaries in traditional grammar. Okay, so here we have a list. Okay, it's not an exhaustive list, but it should give you a sense of how many modal operators we have with various shades of meaning attached to them. So some are stronger, some are not as strong, some can be used for certain meanings, some cannot be used for certain meanings. For example, if you want to talk about ability, I can swim is correct, but if you're talking about ability, you can't say I may swim. That would mean it's possible for me to swim. I may be inclined to swim, but it doesn't mean that you're able. Okay. Okay, so here is a table that you may want to use. It's fairly exhaustive, I would say, if you want to have an idea not only of what the operators are, but also of their strength. You see here we have low, medium, and high, and of course this points, in the case of modalization, to the degree of certainty that is conveyed, and in the case of modulation, to how important, how strong the obligation that's referred to as. Okay, additional comments. You know that will is both a tense and a modal operator, but I think this is pretty straightforward because, you know, students study this since the very beginning of their career as English students. Okay, yeah, talking about ability, yeah, which I've just referred to in my example about I may swim. Some scholars consider it to be at the borders of the modality system, but if you want to include it, and I suggest you do that, it would be modulation inclination. It's a particular type of inclination, and of course it refers to your ability, often physical ability to do something. Okay, may, as I said, cannot express ability, and you know, there's also another important distinction that you may or may not be aware of. Within modulation, there are two different kinds of obligations in English. Internal obligation, that's the obligation that comes from yourself, that you feel, and external obligation, that's when something is imposed by someone else, by some external authority. So let's see some example. Yeah, must and should, which are quite strong, especially must, usually identify an obligation that you feel, something that you know, you feel there's nobody else obliging you to do something, you feel that's your duty, whereas have to and ought to are generally described as expressing external obligations, so they imply that there is some external entity that's asking you to do something. And then this is just out of curiosity, had better has a particular meaning, and I know that this is a frequent cause of misunderstanding for Italian students because they tend to think that it means è meglio. No, it's not è meglio. It means that there's some risk involved if you don't do something. Like, for example, you've been ill for a month. You'd better see a doctor now, you know, and this is also the intonation that you might want to use, implying there's a risk that you're underestimating or you've underestimated up to now. So it's a kind of special modal. Okay. Okay, this is a table also you might want to use. Okay, probability usuality for modulization, inclination and obligation for modulation. Here I think that there's a W missing there. Sorry. Okay, another way in which you can look at models is whether they are subjective or objective. So if the modality is your opinion or it's something that's a fact or presented as a fact, and explicit or implicit, whether the modality is clearly stated in the language or if it's in some way deductible. Okay, let's see some examples. For example, you see, in the columns we have subjective and objective. In the rows we have implicit and explicit. So must, which we've already identified as the strongest modulated model, is both subjective, because there must be an entity that must, I must, you must. Okay, that's the sense in which it's subjective. And implicit, because it's implicit in the operator, in the grammar. Okay, and then if we want to do an implicit objective model this time, we would have like certainly, or we could also have probably. Typically the ly adverbs are objective and implicit. Concerning explicitness, this is quite easy to identify, because wherever explicitness is involved in models, you have expressions like these: I am certain, or he is certain, or you are certain, if it's subjective. So if it's directly attributed to a subject. Instead, it is certain, it is likely, it is probable, and so on, when the explicit modality is objective, because it's presented as an objective fact. Okay. All right, here is another table, and here, as you saw, we were talking about the strength of the models, and actually the most accurate term in functional grammar would be value of the model. The value can be high, medium, or low. Okay, and here is a scale that I think is pretty straightforward for both modalization, which is here, and modulation, which is here. Okay, let's sum up with what you should now be able to identify as a system network. These diagrams, that we often find in functional grammar books, are called system networks. And this summarizes more or less everything I told you up to now. Okay, now there's another little thing you should know about polarity, and it's whether polarity is direct or transferred. Let's see the difference between these two. I think Mary doesn't know. Okay, where is the negation here? Yeah, it's in the statement that the projected clause. Instead here, I don't think Mary knows. Here it's not in the projection, but it's in the projecting clause. Okay, so whereas here the negation is on the proposition that's construed. Here it is on the modality itself. Yeah, you see, if we go back, I think would be a modal, like subjective and explicit. Actually, it would be a metaphor of modality, but we'll talk about this later. Anyway, you know, it's a modal. Why is it modal here? Because it talks about what I think, what I know, what my impression is. So it would be, what would it be? Modulation or modalization? Modalization, exactly. Okay. So let's see another example, another table. This is taken from the book Deploying Functional Grammar by J.R. Martin, Christian Matthewson, and Claire Painter. Okay, as I told you, this is I think in the library's reader, it's pretty useful because it's got many examples, many exercises, and so on. So let's have some more examples to clarify the difference between modalization and modulation. Okay, so here what you should understand from this table is that modalization is linked to the indicative mood. Okay, whereas modulation is linked to the imperative mood. And this, of course, has to do with its the quality of it expressing obligation. Now, let's spend some words about semi-modals. Okay, you know that on top of finite modal operators, we also have these in-between forms. Like I've just shown you one. Had better is typically considered to be a semi-modal, but okay, because it includes two words. But actually, the clearest examples of semi-modals are the ones you see shown here. Like, he needs to do it. It has the same sense of must, but as you see, it behaves differently because it behaves like a normal verb. Okay, so that's the sense in which genuine semi-modals should be distinguished from modals. Okay, now let's spend some more words about modal adjuncts. You know, modal adjuncts are divided into two categories: mood adjuncts and comment adjuncts. Now you see that both of them introduce opinions or degrees of obligation. Actually, there's a list if you want to learn it. It's probability, usuality, willingness, obligation, temporality, and typicality. These are the 6 categories that are involved in mood adjuncts. But you'll learn how to recognize them because they always carry some information that's either related to usuality or to probability, if it's modalization that's involved, or to obligation and inclination if modulation is involved. But if you want, as a start, you can learn probability, usuality, willingness, obligation, temporality, and typicality as a useful mnemonic to keep these in mind. Now, what's the difference between mood adjuncts and comment adjuncts? The main difference is that whereas mood adjuncts refer to just one part of the clause, usually the verb group, the comment adjuncts refer to the whole clause. So we usually find them at the beginning or at the end because they refer to all the clause. Okay? So here is a list, fairly complete, right, of modal adjuncts. And now, seeing here that modal adjuncts include, as you saw before, some expression that refer to time. Like sometimes, usually, you may have become confused. I mean, are all temporal adjuncts modal? Well, no. Actually, most are conjunctive adjuncts, like you see here. Meanwhile, before that, later on, next, soon, finally. Well, actually, it depends. I mean, to make this choice, you have to ask yourself if the adverb, or the adverbial expression that you have, is referring to usuality, to something that is frequent, rare. I mean, if it's evaluating its frequency or typicality, yeah, or I don't know, at first, for example, reservation, in the sense that it's evaluating the reliability, what we're talking about, or if it's only talking about the time as a circumstance, as here. So it's a choice you have to make based on the meaning, based on the context. Okay, let's now talk about yes and no. You remember in my previous lecture I told you that no can be considered to be a polar adjunct, so a mood adjunct. Is this always the case? No, it's not always the case, because it is only when yes and no signal a change in polarity that there are genuine mood adjuncts. When I, for example, answer a question like, is functional grammar interesting? Yes, that's a polarity marker. So, okay, you see what I mean? No. Well, I hope this won't be your question, but it would be a polarity marker, just like if you say yes, it would be a polarity marker because it introduces polarity. But now, if there's no question involved and we use yes only as a continuative, they're outside. You know, you remember continuatives, just like vocatives and expletives, are outside the mood block. They're neither mood nor residue. They're out. So yes, used as a continuative, is not a mood adjunct, and also when it's a minor clause. So for example, if I call you and you say yes, it's not as if you want to change or express the polarity. You would just want to tell me that you're there. So it's only phatic. You know, it's an expression that's there only to keep the channel open. So it's not modal, it's not a